chapter 7, verse 1, Paul says, "Or do you not know, brethren, for I speak to those who know the law, that the law has dominion over a man as long as he lives." We finished out last week on chapter 6. We learned that before a man comes to Christ, we're under bondage to what? Under sin, okay? We literally, it calls us slaves to sin. We're under bondage. We cannot get out from the control and the dominion of sin until we became baptized. We died to that old former self, and then we became a slave to what? Instead. Slave to God, slave to, what else does it say too? Okay. Slave to God, slave to righteousness. We become both of those things. It's a different bondage, a different slavery that we're under. Okay, now he goes into not necessarily talking about slave just to sin, but he talks about those who, he says, I'm speaking to those who know the law, that the law has dominion. That's basically saying again that we're under slavery to that law. It dominates us. We cannot get out of its control and what it means or what it brings, the knowledge of sin. So chapter 6 talks about that bondage of sin. Now we're talking about bondage to the law. Verse 2, now that we're talking about that being as long as he lives. Well, what's the answer to this? Verse 2, "For the woman who has a husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. But if the husband dies, she's released from the law of her husband. So then if, while her husband lives, she marries another man, she will be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she has married another man." So what he's trying to convey, a couple different things. First off, they were going to feel weird. Those that did know the law, that came from a background of having been in the law, they're going to feel weird about going from this to another. They're going to feel like they're committing adultery, okay? Because of what they believe that they are supposed to stick to that law. That's what they've known since they can remember, because their parent, that household, is supposed to teach them that you keep this law. And so that's what they know. To stray from that and to put that aside would feel like to them to be adultery, like they have cheated on what they have known. But what he's saying here is the husband has died. We have, Jesus has nailed the law to the cross. The written code, the requirements that are there, he has nailed that to the cross. And so whenever we participate in that same thing, when we die to our old self, and we are crucified with Christ, as Paul puts it in Galatians 2:20, we become the new creature, just as it said in the tail end of chapter 6, and we're no longer bound. And when we jump from the law into this new thing, we're not committing adultery because we're no longer bound by it. So he makes that very clear. And I think as we read it, that's more of a struggle possibly for them, those that did know the law, that came from that background, than perhaps it is for us. But we still can understand and learn from their specific situation in that we are not under law either. Okay, we are not from a Jewish heritage where we learned the law like they were at that time, and then they had to pass from it. But I've grown up, and I know the Ten Commandments. I know the laws, or at least a lot of the laws that God has put forth. So I, in 21st century, could place myself under the law as if I have to keep it perfectly, and if I don't, then I'm condemned. That is something that we could do. He's called us to something else. Verse 4, therefore, my brethren, you also have become dead to the law through the body of Christ, that you may be married to another, to him who was raised from the dead, that we should bear fruit to God. Okay? When we died to the law, when he's trying to suggest that, we did not die to righteousness or doing anything good or being held accountable to do anything that is right. That is not what we died to. As in, the law's out of the way, have at it with the sin. Right? Chapter 6, we covered that. We made that clear that that's not what this is telling us. In fact, as soon as that we're dead to the law, what do we become married to? This is a law analogy, but it's also a marriage analogy. Who are we married to? Christ, for sure. Okay, so when we're married to and alive and we're attached to the body of Christ, what then does it suggest that we ought to be doing? Obeying, and specifically there it says bearing fruit to God. As it says in verse 5, it says, for when we were in the flesh, the sinful passions which were aroused by the law were at work in our members to bear fruit to death. So we're going to bear fruit of some kind, but what is it going to be? At first we were bearing fruit, but it was to death. And those that were under the law weren't just necessarily just saying we're not under anything, right? They didn't just say we'll just go out and do whatever we want to. They were trying to follow God, but as soon as they mess up, what does that lead to? It leads to death, right? Because as soon as you've sinned once, you're guilty of all the law. You're guilty of having broken all of it. And so as soon as we couldn't keep that, that led to death. But we're no longer in the flesh is what it's trying to tell us there. I go back to that old man analogy in chapter 6. The old man's gone, the new man is here. We've created something new. It's in Christ. We're supposed to bear fruit to God. So verse 6. But now we have been delivered from the law, having died to what we were held by, so that we should serve in the newness of the Spirit and not in the oldness of the letter. What does that mean to y'all? I want to read that again and see if we can open this up to some comments. But now we have been delivered from the law, having died to what we were held by, so that we should serve in the newness of the Spirit and not in the oldness of the letter. Yes?
Things were not tied to the Old Testament.
Okay.
It's kind of like if we move the laws of every part of the country is different.
Mm-hmm.
So if we move to another, we have to be like them.
Yeah.
And that's the way this is.
Yeah.
We move from sin, and now we have to be like Jesus.
That's an interesting analogy. Yeah, I mean, you move and it's a new situation, and it's probably uncomfortable because, if I were to move from Arkansas and go to maybe Texas or something, and then I get pulled over for breaking whatever law they would say, I'd say, well, back where I'm from, it wasn't like that. We're under a new situation. I'm sure that for them was very difficult to adjust.
Well, their laws were physical, and ours are spiritual.
That's right.
Well, you really care.
Yeah. Can't keep all of them. Yes.
Well, I would say that it's, we have this concept of the spirit of the law, the letter of the law, and you can keep the letter of the law while ignoring the spirit of the law. An example is it is illegal to burn garbage in the city of Searcy, including limbs, leaves, any kind of yard waste.
Mm-hmm.
It is not illegal to have a bonfire in the city of Searcy. So you can gather up a pile of leaves and burn them for the sake of a bonfire instead It's one of those things where the Old Testament was full of specific do this, do this, do this. Paul says he kept the law in all good conscience until this day, when he's speaking there at the end of the book of Acts. He says, I've kept the law in all good conscience until this day, including imprisoning to kill Christians.
Yep.
Was that keeping the spirit of the law or the letter of the law? It was keeping the letter of the law without keeping the spirit of the law. So here I think he's saying we're freed from that letter of the law analysis and interpretation, but we do have to keep the spirit of the law, which is why Jesus said there's two greatest commandments. And those supersede everything else because they include everything else. And if you've missed that point, then you've really missed the law.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and that great analogy and way of thinking of it, because we can keep the letter and still miss it. I think that he makes that point quite a bit. Romans 2:29, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, not in the letter, whose praise is not from men, but from God. That's early in the chapter. He's made that point already. Okay? We kind of forget it because it's been several weeks since I did Romans 2. But he's already said that in this letter. If we read it all together, we kind of get that point a little more closely. So circumcision was a physical thing that they were supposed to do. He's saying, well, now that's of the heart that we obey that. And so I want to look at one more example where I feel like certain Jews had missed this very point. Luke chapter 6, verse 1 and 2, or starting in verse 1. Now it happened on the second Sabbath after the first that he went through the grain fields, and his disciples plucked the heads of grain and ate them, rubbing them in their hands. And some of the Pharisees said to them, why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath? But Jesus answered them and said, have you not even read this? What David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he went into the house of God, took and ate the showbread, and also gave some to those with him? Which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, which is what they knew to be the case. And he said to them, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. So he also says in another place that man was not made for the Sabbath, but Sabbath was made for man. And that's just one example where they kind of had missed what the law was trying to get for them. Is that God didn't create somebody, he didn't create the law, and then he's like, you know what? It'd be awesome if I had some people that I could create just so that they could keep the Sabbath. They had missed the point that he created man, and then he created the Sabbath for man. And the Pharisees and all those who completely had missed that, who had actually added things to the Sabbath and held over people, they just really didn't get it. And I think that point can be applied to Romans 7 here, where they just totally missed the spirit of the law.
Well, also you got, I think you can read this into it a little bit, that when you become a Christian or when God gets in your life, you got the spiritual side of you, you got the physical side of you.
Mm-hmm.
You got two personalities. Which personality is the most strongest in your life? Your fleshly personality or your godly personality? Your spirit dwells inside of you.
Mm-hmm.
It's supposed to control your outlook, your way you do things. Control is these things we talked about last week, our eyes and stuff like that. That's the fleshly side of you, your members. And you got to learn how to control the fresh side of it. And the spiritual, it's got to take over your life side of it.
Yeah, that's what it's really going to hit on in Romans 8, 5, and 6. For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, and that's what they're accomplishing. But those who live according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit, verse 13, for if you live according to the flesh, you're going to die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body. You use the Spirit to control what your body's doing. That's what he's eventually going to get to. I think that's a great point.
Maybe I got ahead of you.
No, I mean that's where we're headed, and I like to see that to help give context to what's in chapter 7. I think that's a key. One other thing I was going to add to that, as far as the spirit of the law versus the letter of it. I mean, greatest example, which I was fixing to miss, was Jesus talking about adultery. Well, you could maybe not physically cheat on your wife, but perhaps you're looking at all these other women to lust for them. Well, have you not committed adultery in your heart, even if it wasn't physical? You have. And so there's the spirit of the law where you could say, I'm not guilty at all because I haven't physically done anything yet. But God cares about the spirit. He cares about that for sure. And so we need to keep it in subjection and to live by His Spirit. Romans 7, verse 7. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Okay, here's where I have to pause. Because I think everywhere leading up to this so far, we've talked about how that law got to die to that law. And that law has had dominion over us. You know, it's been held over us. It's been this thing that, seemingly it seems bad. You know, the word dominion, it almost seems like it's being used in a negative sense. And partly it is. And we're talking about when we were living under the law, we were in the flesh, we bore fruit to death. So, having read all that so far, what do you think he's going to say about the law? Is it good?
Yes.
Okay, he is going to say that. Okay, but so far it almost doesn't seem like that. So I want us to catch that this very much almost seems like a contrast unless we dig in and understand it. Verse 7, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? Certainly not. On the contrary, I would not have known sin except through the law, for I would not have known covetousness unless the law had said, you shall not covet. So, and in verse 12, I'll go ahead and jump and look at it. It says, therefore, the law is holy, and the commandment holy and just, and it's good. He has great things to say about the law, and he's going to continue to hold firm on that. The law is good. But let's back up and just look at verse 7 and verse 8 for a second. He talks about the law is not sin. In fact, it's not sin. It's not causing us to sin. What is it doing? It's telling us what it is. It's making us aware. It's not causing sin. It's revealing sin. Is what it's doing. And so I think of chapter 4, verse 15, because the law brings about wrath, for where there is no law, there is no transgression. We wouldn't know what that sin is, but that law, when we transgress the law, it brings about that wrath. Okay, so that's one example. I look at verse 8. Okay, look at the phrase that says, "But sin, taking opportunity by the commandment." Taking opportunity by the commandment. That phrase right there comes from a Greek word, as I found it to be, that it was referring to like an enemy camp, like their base of operations, that we're going to use this to then, it's like a foothold. It gives us that foothold and we can use it from that point on. Okay, so it's like an army's base of operations. That's what this law through sin is being allowed to do. It's taking opportunity by the commandment. And so I like to use the example of Adam and Eve in this case. When they were in the garden, God created them. Before he gave them that commandment, what's Satan going to tempt them to do? They don't have the commandment yet. As soon as God gave them a commandment, and what was it? Don't eat an apple?
Don't eat the fruit.
Yeah, that doesn't seem like too bad of a deed, does it? But that was the commandment. That was what he wanted them not to do. And so what did Satan hit them with? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, did God really say this? And, here's what Satan does. He promises a couple things. He promises us that God, through telling us not to do that, he's withholding something from us. No sex before marriage. Well, why is he holding that back from me? When he says, you shouldn't partake in these substances that are, altering your mind. Well, why is he holding that back from me? When he says, you shouldn't go out and get drunk. Why won't God let me participate in these good things like everyone else? That's what Satan's telling us.
Do you think that a lot of the time when we find out something is sinful, that it makes us want to do it? Because
I
it
think
sounds like fun.
there's an element of that, but I think, there's evil desire comes. Sometimes it comes from knowing what the commandment was, but, when he uses the example here about you shall not covet, if I see a really nice truck going down the road and I'm, driving, my beat up truck and I'm thinking, I wouldn't mind having that person's truck. I don't know. When I read this, I think I didn't need somebody to tell me that coveting was wrong to think, I kind of want that truck, But what it did was it revealed to me that it was wrong. That I've now transgressed God's law. And so what does that do then? It brings about guilt, and I've also done something that was unrighteous and unholy before God. Not only that, I know about it because I knew the law.
Want that truck, you should want one just like it.
Exactly. That's right. So I think part of it produces in us, there's a spirit of rebellion. But I also think sometimes we just mess up and we weren't trying to rebel or having a spirit of rebellion, but we're fallible human beings. We mess up, but when we know that law, what does it then reveal to us when we mess up? It reveals that we messed up and guilt comes, and it brings about death if we're not in Christ. And so this is a difficult thing to sit here and look at, but sin takes opportunity. Okay, I want to go back to that phrase. It takes opportunity by the commandment. It says, God's holding us back, or look what you're missing. You've got to try this. And that's where the evil desire comes from. I've got to test this out. There's going to be no consequences. God didn't really say that. There's no consequences. He also says that God is holding back on you. That's a lie that sin tells us. It's a promise that it makes. There's a lot of promises that sin makes, but that's one of them. If we can be aware of it, I think that'll help us.
Where we have strong faith, we know when somebody's trying to do it.
Yeah. I think that's and I don't want to get ahead of myself. That's kind of verse 9 and 10 is going to get into the fact that the law was supposed to be something that was good for us. It was supposed to bring life. And this wasn't a mistake by God where he thought, this will work, and then it didn't work out, and his plan got foiled. But the law is supposed to bring life. If we look at Leviticus 18, verse 5, it says, "You shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man does, he shall live by them. I am the Lord." The law was supposed to be something that's good for us, but we did not keep all of his laws. We couldn't do it. And so we realized that we're fallible and we again need God. We couldn't keep it ourselves. And I think that eventually it will point out that brings to the glory of God, that instead of us pulling ourselves up, God got to do it. Because of his love, he wanted to rescue us from it. I think of Ephesians 4, verse 27. Talks about giving a foothold to the devil, or giving place to the devil. And that just reminded me of Romans 7, verse 8, that phrase that I don't think it's using the same phrase or the same Greek word, but it still reminds me that we're giving Satan an opportunity. We're giving him a foothold. We're giving him a base of operations to where we might listen to him. We see the law, and then sin takes that opportunity. We have to, as we were saying earlier, we have to use the Spirit to put to death those evil deeds. So we'll read verse 9 and 10. "I was alive once without the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. And the commandment which was to bring life, I found to bring death." Okay, that commandment was there to bring life. You know, it's good, it's holy, it's just. That's what we're about to read. But sin took occasion by the commandment. It deceived me, and by it killed me. 1 John chapter 3, verse 4 says, "Whoever commits sin also commits lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness." It's making the connection right there that the law is sin. Okay, it wasn't this other thing. Let me back up, because I said that totally wrong. I said the law is sin. That's the point that we totally made opposite. Breaking the law is sin. It brought to us what sin is. It told us what sin is. And so the law is not sin. Sin is lawlessness. It revealed everything to us. It's still just. It's still holy. It's still good. But it's just not binding to us in the same way. Yes?
So I think a good analogy here is, if you've ever been around a toddler, raised a toddler, there are a lot of things that the toddlers might accidentally do that might get them in trouble, but you explicitly tell them, don't put something in that electrical socket. Now, if they put something in the electrical socket before you tell them, they're still going to be dead. But once you tell them, don't put something in that electrical socket, suddenly, for some reason, they become aware of the electrical socket. And now they're curious about the electrical socket. And they really, really want to put something in that electrical socket. And so the law that you give them, don't touch the electrical socket, is not a bad law. It helps them understand, but it also brings them awareness of the possibility of shoving something in that electrical socket.
Well, that's one we do think wrong. We still have our physical side, but our life should be Jesus.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I like the electrical socket example, and that makes me think of verse 1. This is context. Context determines meaning. Who's he talking to right now?
People that know the law.
People that know the law. Okay, so all of this that we're talking about was those who were under the law, and the law, the sin took opportunity by the law to bring about sin, but can it do that without the law? Can't you mess up without the law? I mean, yeah, you can stick the deal into the wall, and that could kill you without the rule. But God meant it for good. He's trying to help us see what's right and wrong. Maybe we can learn some stuff by trusting and obeying in Him. And there's nothing wrong with that law. That's a great point for us to understand. But He's trying to reveal right now to those who do know the law. We already made the point in chapter 1 and chapter 2 that even without the law, you're still guilty. The Gentiles were still guilty because they had a conscience, and they also were condemned by their conscience. And so those are all great points. Verse 13, has then what is good become death to me? Again, he's backing up the fact that the law was good, it's holy, it's just. It's still that way. Has then what is good become death to me? Certainly not. But sin, that it might appear sin, was producing death in me through what is good, so that sin through the commandment might become exceedingly sinful. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. I had to read that passage a lot about the phrase exceedingly sinful, trying to determine what exactly that means. Again, he's speaking to those who know the law. It helped them see exactly what sin was, and made it very clear that this is sin. It appeared to them as sin, and that was clear to them. Not only could the conscience tell them, the Gentiles could know it, but also God literally told you don't do this. And so that helped you see that it was wrong. I think that's one point in there. One point I think that's being made from verse 13. It says, but sin, that it might appear sin, was producing death in me through what is good, so that sin through the commandment might become exceedingly sinful. Romans 6:8 talks about the status that we're supposed to be under now. Now, if we died with Christ, we believe that we shall also live with Him. That we've put off the old man, we've come into the new, that the situation he's describing here, if we were left in that state, we would be in a status of death, but we died to the old self and we put on the new man. And so we're also put out from that type of relationship, and we're now slaves to, as we said before, slaves to the body of Christ, slaves to God, and slaves to righteousness. One passage that I thought of from this was Genesis 50 and verse 20. And I want to remind us of the context here where Joseph had a situation where his brothers did some pretty bad stuff to him. And they meant it for evil. It's pretty clear on that. Genesis 50 verse 20, here's what it says. But as for you, he's speaking to his brothers, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is to this day, to save many people alive. God produced this law. We took the law and we produced stuff that was not great. We sinned from it. God meant it for good. We kind of turned it and made made some evil from it. We sinned, and it did produce death. But God produces good in all of these situations. We look at the law and what we use the law for, and we thought, well, God didn't really come up with the greatest invention there, the law. That didn't work out. That's what we think, because we used it and we sinned. We thought God should have, thought around that one. No, that's on us. And so we used it for evil, and God is still using it for good. It produced in them. They used it for sin. It showed them that they were guilty. And what happens now when they were just full of guilt, sinful? What happens now that instead of us getting to show that we were perfect, we by the flesh pulled ourselves up and became alive and righteous? Instead of us getting to take credit, who gets to take credit now? Jesus. And so God used it all for good, and it comes to His glory.
Yeah, verse 14 there, in Romans,
Mm-hmm.
says, for we know that the law is spiritual, but we are souls under sin.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the trouble is.
Yeah.
People don't accept that.
Well, I want to take that and run with it a little bit, but verses 15 through 25, Paul's fixing to get into a very famous kind of monologue there, where he discusses his human flesh versus his human mind and spirit, and trying to work against sin. And we don't have time to really get into all that, and I would like to. I think that would be great. There's a couple verses I want to read as kind of a cliffhanger and a precursor to what's coming up. First off, it says, for we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. Is that still Paul's situation? Go back to chapter 6. Yeah, he was sold under sin for a while, but then what did he do? Is he still a slave to sin?
No, because he accepted God.
Accepted God, he's a slave to righteousness. Is he still going to struggle or ever mess up? I think so. And I'm sure some of it will be because of his situation where his mind and his spirit is not perfect in combating the flesh. I think some of the phrases he uses in there still maybe stand in a Christian's life, but I also think that part of the battle he's discussing there in the coming verses, we're talking about his battle when he was under the law. Okay, I want to read 2 verses. Chapter 6, verse 17 and 18. But God be thanked that though you were slaves of sin, carnal and sold under sin, like he's saying, yet you obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine to which you were delivered. Where are we now? It says, and having been set free from sin, you became slaves of righteousness. We're not a slave to sin anymore, is not what it's telling me. Chapter 8, verse 5 and 6. For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. Chapter 7 does not sound like he's in a lot of peace. It sounds like he still has a mind that's under the flesh. Now, when I think of those under the law versus the Gentiles, I don't think of them all as being under the flesh. I think of those being under the law And then the Gentiles just did whatever they thought best. They were in the flesh. But those under the law are under the flesh too, because they don't have the Spirit of Christ. And so they're under a little bit of a different circumstance. Okay, that will be kind of a cliffhanger going into the next lesson. I will be home for Christmas and will not be here next Sunday. So prepare for Genesis chapter 40 if you want to read that throughout this week. And then I will be back and we'll catch the rest of this cliffhanger. It's a great study. I encourage you to read ahead. And I thank y'all for the comments and for all of class.